So we've discussed why writing every day doesn't necessarily make you a better writer. And people say, oh, so the story, the structure makes people this bad story, and it makes story predictable, and it makes it bad, and it makes it corny. No! It's because we need to refine the writing. Draft after draft after draft after draft after draft, refine it, make it better. Structure is not the enemy. The lack of structure is the enemy. Does structure make your story predictable? Well, short answer, no, it does not. Have you guys seen Interstellar? Okay, how about a film called Nocturnal Animals? The Prestige? What about Everything Everywhere All at Once? So this point is being discussed by so many people in so many different Facebook groups and Reddit threads and forums, and also in this really, really great read called Kill the Dog by Paul Geo. We'll get to this later. Now, these materials allude to the idea that these structure techniques messes up the mind of the writer, that the structure techniques are bad for new writers. And I'm here to tell you that's complete and utter BS. I have sat in a classroom, and I remember this like it was yesterday. I will never, ever forget it. And this is why I cling to structure techniques so closely on the channel. And it was one of those show and tell days where you would write and you would come in, and then the professor would pick one person's script to read. And so all the students were forced to listen to the girl's screenplay for about 40 minutes straight, aloud. In that screenplay, there were so many different characters, they all sounded different, so many different locations that added texture to the story. But the entire time we were reading her script, the pages were flipping, things were happening left and right, conversations were being had, characters were moving place to place discussing various issues, but there was no story to latch onto. So in essence, there was nothing truly going on. There were things happening, but nothing was happening at the same time. Nothing. Why? No structure. This screenwriter was not taught any kind of structure technique, nor were they implementing any structure technique. We were actually reading Robert McKee's story, and it's very clear that she didn't understand what was going on in story, because story is kind of complicated, and it kind of doesn't give you a straightforward structure technique that you can utilize. It kind of just gives you a framework to work off of that she obviously did not use either. But the read was just so mind-numbingly bad and boring. Like, truthfully and respectfully, this was one of the biggest waste of class times that we've ever had. That I've ever had in my whole college experience. There was no clear story to lean onto, to cling onto. Shit was just happening, page to page. People were talking without anything truly of substance going on, or nothing connecting the characters together. No events building on top of each other, linking all these random events together. Even if she used what people hate using nowadays, which is the save the cat beat sheet. If she had used that damn beat sheet, we would not have been bored out of our minds trying to bash our heads on the damn table, because her story made no kind of sense whatsoever. It was like a day in the life, but she wasn't cognizant of the fact that it was a day in the life. And this is why I get so amped up when people shit on structure techniques, when they say structure is bad. In my brain, I replay that day over and over again in my brain, and I'm just thinking to myself, the obvious, clear fix to that story would have been clear structure. And people say, oh, so the story, the structure makes people this bad story, and it makes story predictable, and it makes it bad, and it makes it corny. No! It's because we need to refine the writing. Draft after draft after draft after draft after draft, refine it, make it better. Structure is not the enemy. The lack of structure is the enemy. So stop it. Stop blaming structure techniques. John Truby's 22 Steps is not the enemy. Dan Harmon's Story Circle is not the enemy. Blake Snyder's Beat Sheet is not the enemy. The Hero's Journey is not the enemy. Michael Haig's 6 Stages of Story Structure is not the enemy. Little did you know, if you dug infinitely deeper into that predictable, flat story, your story got 99 problems, but structure ain't one of them. See what positive aspects of storytelling those structure techniques are giving to those stories, superimpose the substance of those story structure techniques beneath your story so that it's going places and it's not going nowhere. I implore you to research structure techniques. Don't assume that one structure technique is gonna work for you all the time. It's not. Our jobs as writers is to learn about the intrinsic muscle movements of story so that we can know how story works, so that we can know how stories function. And once you know those intrinsic muscle movements of story, you can say, okay, these are the things that my first draft does not have. It's not, oh, I don't have a catalyst in my story, or I don't have an inciting incident in my story. It's what emotions did that inciting incident elicit to my audience? You're like, oh, okay, that's why it exists. If I don't want to make an inciting incident in my story, think about what event in your story could elicit a similar emotion if you want to go off the grain or against the grain. See, in your first draft, your characters, they may have flat dialogue. Well, what's flat dialogue? It could be too on the nose. Your characters might not have any internal conflict, or the action that you're displaying on screen simply isn't optimal to convey what emotion you're trying to convey. You may have too many characters. You may not have enough characters. You may not have the right payoff to the right setup, or you might not have the right setup to the right payoff. Your film's climax might be suboptimal. But as long as I have that dreaded memory in my brain where this person clearly had no structure whatsoever, there is not anyone in the world who could convince me that structure is a bad thing, that reverse engineering is a bad thing. Reverse engineering in writing is how masterpieces are made. Now, there are lightnings in bottles that can create magic, and they don't need shit. They don't need anything. They just make magic. It's magic, like fairy dust. I'm not one of those people. Most of us are not one of those people. So I cannot be convinced that there isn't a structure technique that is optimal for your story. Maybe it's not a structure technique that exists already. Maybe it's one that you created along the years. But no one can tell me that structure techniques are not useful to the writer. Can these structure techniques get in the way of your creative processes? Sometimes it can, and we'll get to that. But that's why it's important to understand how you want your audience to feel while they're reading or watching your story unfold, and pinpoint what aspects of the story drew you to it to begin with. If you're not a fan of structure outlines and techniques, that's fine. Basic outline, just before you get started, just what happens in your story, just generally, broadly, where do you want your story to go? Just write that down so that you don't feel like writing down an outline constricts your creativity or whatever. We live in a world where we have access to a million different structure techniques, and each and every one of those screenwriting gurus are arguing why their structure technique is the best. But the truth is, none of them are the best. That is the truth. None of them are the best. None of them. It depends on which one works for you as a writer, and more specifically, which one works the best for the story that you are writing in that moment. Do I think you should kind of do a little outline before you write your first draft? Sure, I think you should. If you've won, all these screenwriting competitions and you've got, films being optioned left and right, you don't need a story structure technique. That's fine. I'm not saying you guys need a story structure technique at that stage, right? In that case, don't use a story structure technique at all. But what I will say, some of y'all need a story structure technique. Like white need rice. And this is where I have to disagree with Paul Gio's point in Kill the Dog. Because I want to reiterate this. If the writer in that classroom reading us that dull-ass bad story with colorful characters and beautiful locations had structure, I wouldn't have been forced to listen to that bullshit. And you wouldn't be getting this video because I'd have nothing to say. Now, I'm here to tell you that Paul Gio's Kill the Dog is a great book. This is a great book for screenwriters to read. Assuming you have versed yourself in screenwriting technique and structure and story, this is a good read because he touches on a lot of points that are very, very, very true. This is a working writer. This guy knows what he's talking about. But here he talks a little bit about the dangers of using many of these different story structure techniques. And I believe I'm up to page 80-ish, yeah. The number one thing that Paul Gio is saying in this book so far is that there are no shortcuts in writing. There are no shortcuts. So these story structure techniques are not a shortcut. There's no shortcuts to great writing. You just have to write and rewrite and learn how you function as a creative and let that guide you. I thought that was very insightful. He mentions how you write matters. How you write words on the page actually matters, which a lot of these books behind me, they miss that mark. They don't talk about syntax and grammar because he mentions brilliantly that it is the words on the page that are the tools that make your reader feel something, that elicits that emotion in the reader, that gets moviegoers to feel something. So the number one thing Paul Geo wants you to learn how to do is to learn how to write. And I completely agree. And like I said, he mentions that teaching individuals about the many ways that you can write well is missed in a lot of these books back here, like writing a basic sentence. He's not talking about big picture. He's talking about you got to learn how to write a sentence first really well, learn how to string those sentences together to elicit the strongest emotion and not make it bland, which is true. I understand that aspect in many of these screenwriting books behind me is missing. They kind of teach you to look at the big picture. So I'd like to thank Paul and tell him he's right about that. But teaching someone how to write their stories well, it's like teaching an inventor how to invent something that they've never invented before. That's what teaching someone how to write well is. It's not an easy task. It's damn near impossible, actually. But we can outline a process that has worked for us and share it to the world so that we see less garbage on the screen. That's what we can do, which is by and large what these writers behind me with all these books and all these gurus are behind me, they're trying to say. That's what I believe that they've been doing. They've been sharing what they have learned from their perspective and imparting it on us. And also, he mentions that many of these screenwriting books were written by screenwriters who have no real heavy credentials, which again, fair point. He also indirectly states and kind of directly states that Save the Cat doesn't teach writers how to write well. Doesn't teach you about all the aspects on how to craft a solid sentence to elicit the best emotional response in the audience. And I completely agree with that point. Many of these screenwriting books do harp on structure, and they don't focus too much on what words is being used on the page and how these words should be used for maximum impact. He also mentions how these structure techniques can creatively impair our abilities to craft a solid story. I will say this, when you start writing a story, you gotta know which structure technique to use that will work for your story. Otherwise, it's gonna be freaking confusing. And you're not gonna know if it has all the beats, right, that work for you. And if you're thinking, this story does not have all the beats, use Dan Harmon's story circle. See what I did there? We have our story knowledge, we have our story utility belt, and so we say that the beat sheet's not gonna work for this story, might have to use Dan Harmon's story circle. It'll work better. Or Michael Haig's 6-stage story structure technique might work better. Yes, I have had these story structure techniques get in the way of my creative processes. So I appreciate that because I've experienced this creative writing paralysis myself. So when you're dealing with a more complex idea, it can be hard to structure this complex idea around a story structure technique. So in that instance, I'd say write. Write what you feel on the page. Write. Write until you're blue in the face. Write until you figured it out. But what these books behind me do a great job at is that they are teaching you the individual elements of storytelling that a writer ought to know. A writer ought to know what a setup and a payoff is. A writer ought to know what internal conflict is. A writer ought to know what an inciting incident is supposed to do. A writer ought to know what a climax is supposed to look like, feel like, represent. Writers should know what a midpoint should mean with respect to the story that you are creating. And remember, I'm not yet done with the book, but I believe that Paul Geo in this book, since he's saying, you don't need structure, structure will arrive. It'll happen as you get better. I think he's given people a little bit too much credit. Just a little bit. What do you mean by that, Alan? Well, I'll read it to you. You learn to write by writing. Fact. You get better with every page you write, every scene, every script. False. This is a lie. But I know that you get better at writing after you've had some time to reflect on your story, and then you'll be able to see what your story does not have that it could use to make it better. But first you've got to know how your story should make the audience feel. And to make your audience feel a certain way, it's probably a good idea to know what has been done, so you don't risk running into cliches. Oh, I've seen that before. So it's really important to do your homework on the craft and to study what things have been done in screenplays previously so that you cannot make those same mistakes. When you've had time to reflect, you can analyze different characteristics that your story has that may be detracting from what your script is trying to say. You only get better by being critical with yourself. And then you begin to identify what makes that scene boring. What makes that scene extraneous? Why did that character have to die? Or why isn't this overall story working? You've got to be able to break stories down to its most fundamental elements and be able to discern what works and what things don't work. Only if you've been given the gift of gab can you write and write and write and get better with every script that you're writing and you're writing and you're writing and get better with each and every script. Getting better doesn't work by continuing to do that over and over and over again, because you could just be doing the same twists, the same things over and over and over again in an endless cycle, not getting any better. Raise your hand if you've written a second draft that was worse than the first draft. The first draft was much better because it had that heart and soul. It had that voice that Paul Gio talks about in this book. He mentions how important voice is to the writer. And that's something that screenwriting competitions and all kinds of different writing gurus, when you submit your works, they take all that emotion out of these action lines and take that word, the way you're saying the word, it's not clear to... He does a good job at identifying that screenwriting competitions and coverage services is kind of all a ruse, which is very interesting. Final thoughts. I'm excited to finish this book, and I do believe I have a lot to learn from Paul Gio because he is a great writer. But this point kind of struck a raw chord in my brain, and I had to get it out. Because I think structure techniques are here to say, hey, these are the mistakes that have been made in the past. Here's how you can make the story just make sense. Make it build on each other. These are the mistakes that everyone has made before you. I don't think these story structure techniques are here to say, your story will be perfect after you implement it. It'll be perfect, nothing wrong with it. There'll be nothing wrong. No, it's not what I believe. These story structure techniques are tools that you can use as a writer to make your stories better, to make your stories shine bright. Or you can leave them. I'll leave you with this, something that Paul says. Forgive me for making one last golf analogy, but consider this. If you were taught to play wrong, to swing poorly, and you practice that way every day for a year, you will not be a better golfer. You will be a year worse than you were before because you will have been grooving bad habits. He's saying that screenwriting structure techniques are detrimental to writers. We've already discussed why I disagree, but let's take a fighting analogy and say you want to learn how to fight. And someone tells you, just fight every day. You'll learn how to fight as long as you continue to learn how to fight and just learn how to fight. By how? Fighting. The more you fight, the better you'll become. Nah, dojos, who needs them? Classes? Techniques? Dojos exist for a reason. Coaches exist for a reason. You can try to tackle somebody to the ground, sure. Or you can learn all of the most effective techniques to take someone down. And the next time you're in a fight, assuming you've been trained, and you'll be able to draw on the endless techniques that you've learned throughout the years of actually learning how to fight. So we've discussed why writing every day doesn't necessarily make you a better writer. There are different directors and screenwriters in Hollywood. They produce work after work after work after work, and the work that they produced 20 years ago is the best. Story, structure, technique, everything is the best objectively than the work that they are creating today. He says, if you write every day for a year, focusing on telling your story your way in your voice, you will be a much, much better writer than when you began. Listen, I understand where he's coming from. I understand what he's trying to say, but assuming what he's saying is true, how many times have we seen writers and directors produce stellar work early on in their career, but later on haven't seemed to make a film or produce a film that was as good as their earlier works. We've seen it many times. Now, I do believe that your script should be written in your very own voice. And above all, I think that's what you got to take away from this book so far. And you have to write your film or screenplay in such a way that elicits the maximum amount of emotion for the audience. I'm going to leave you with this. What these books behind me, what the screenwriting books behind me try to get writers to do is a process called reverse engineering. And they're trying to get you to reverse engineer your masterpiece. Their techniques are attempts to get us to reverse engineer greatness in our works. And I know that I'm getting infinitely more out of this book because I'm aware of all of the storytelling techniques that he's talking about in this book, that he's shitting on, quite frankly, in this book. To my point, Paul Gio, writer of this book, Kill the Dog, mentions that it's probably a good idea to have something called a central dramatic argument in your film. And that's the thing that ties it all together. Now, unless I'm mistaken, Blake Snyder called this concept thematic premise. Robert McKee, who he shits on epically, called this concept a controlling idea. I'm saying that this you don't need a structure kind of BS stands on the shoulders of all of the great screenplays that came before it. And quite frankly, I think this book stands better on top of the shoulders of all of the other screenwriting books that came before it. And this is a great addition to add to your screenwriting repertoire. You know, I've gotten my grievances out on camera. But I'm gonna keep reading Kill the Dog by Paul Gio. It's a really good book, highly recommended to folks who have read, you know, normal screenwriting books previously and are aware of screenwriting techniques that have been presented. He has a really insightful perspective. That was my rant. It's always a pleasure chatting with you guys. Until next time, peace.